I do apologize for being late, although it wasn't my fault. And I'm really delighted to be here, although I wish I could actually say I've actually seen anything of your campus. But it's my first time at the University of Dallas, and I think whatever forces and powers have been trying to keep me away from here for many decades, in spite of my wishes to visit, have finally been thwarted. So I'm thrilled to be at this campus that has been the home of so many people who I admire over the years, who've taught here, who established this institution, and many of my friends who have sent their children here, and many people I've known who graduated from here. So thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out today. This would be, of course, an incredibly beautiful day in South Bend, Indiana. So maybe it's the fact that it's not an incredibly beautiful day in Dallas is part of the reason why you're here. So I'll just, since I'm here running obviously a little bit later than expected, I'll just offer the briefest, I hope, of comments and try to open things up fairly quickly. So I recently published this book. It's actually about a year ago. Came out in January of this year, called Why Liberalism Failed. And the basic thesis, and this will be a lesson to all of you who someday want to write books, have a thesis you can summarize in one sentence, and my thesis is that liberalism has failed because liberalism has succeeded. That its core principles, what it set out to do, it succeeded in doing, or the people who sought to advance these principles succeeded in realizing its core principles. And in a sense, the liberal democracy that many of us, I doubtless in this room, feel some devotion to and some nostalgia for, was in some ways when it was not fully realized, when it was not fully itself, when it was mixed in some ways by a kind of certain currents that prevented it from becoming fully itself. So what does it mean to become fully itself? Well, I'll just focus on two of the themes that we might say are at the core of the liberal tradition. And these themes, I think, are summarized quite well in what's often a favorite chapter, especially among conservatives, in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This is in Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 1. It's why democratic peoples will come to love equality more than liberty. And it's a favorite because it sort of helps to explain why it is that, for example, people are willing to sacrifice some degree of their liberties for the sake of egalitarian ends. But what Tocqueville actually says in that chapter is this is in fact not the fullest condition, or that to which liberal democracy aims. That liberal democracy, in fact, has a kind of telos. It has a kind of end toward which it is oriented, a kind of final point of what he calls perfection, where it perfects itself. He describes this as the most perfect form that equality can take on earth, which he states can be imagined as an extreme point at which freedom and equality touch each other and intermingle. Such a condition he envisions as one in which human beings, none differing from those like them, no one will be able to exercise a tyrannical power. Men will be perfectly free because they are perfectly equal, and they will all be perfectly equal because they will all be entirely free. This is the ideal toward which democratic peoples tend. So if they prefer equality over liberty, it will only be for a period of time that the ideal, that the telos to which liberal democracy aims, is the kind of perfect freedom and perfect equality that in some ways is the end, the trajectory, the telos of liberalism as I describe it in my book. And what Tocqueville here describes ought to be in some ways familiar to those of you who study political philosophy, because it resembles nothing other than that condition which is described by one of liberalism's founders as our natural state, as our natural condition, as that which exists if we could think of human beings in what's described as a state of nature. And I'm referring here, of course, to John Locke and before him to Thomas Hobbes. Why is it they propose this? Because all of us, in some way or another, don't exist ideally in the state of perfect equal liberty. It has to be imagined, conceptualized as a condition that if we could imagine ourselves into a condition where we had no history, no tradition, no particular moment in time into which we were born into, no particular relationships that defined who we were, including parents, presumably, no set of customs in which we were raised. If we could imagine ourselves sort of stripped down, this would be the natural conditions of human beings, which Locke describes in the Second Treatise of Government as a condition in which we would have complete liberty to dispose of our persons and our property as we wish, without any external obstacle to this condition of equal liberty. And that we're all equally free because none of us is born in a position of superiority, in a position of authority over anyone else. This is the condition of perfect equality and perfect liberty. But this has to be conceptualized as a theoretical condition because, as I said, it's not one certainly that Locke would have seen in his time. In his time, certainly, everyone would have been born into a status and a position. This was an aristocratic society. Someone like Alexis de Tocqueville, 100 years later, of course, is defined by the fact he's de Tocqueville. He's of Tocqueville. He's of the estate and the place and the people of Tocqueville. Who you are is in many ways defined by who and where you come from. This condition, this natural state, is then, you could say, it's an imaginary condition, but one which, as Tocqueville suggests, can be realized over time, not through nature, but through artifice, through craft, through the creation of the conditions that allow us to become equally free from each other, from the natural world, ultimately self-defining creatures. If the great political theorist, French political theorist, Bertrand de Jouvenel could waggishly state that the imaginings of the social contract theorists were the fancies of childless men who had forgotten their own childhood. What Alistair MacIntyre has also described as a condition in which we imagine ourselves always to be approximately 28 years old. The condition in which we imagine that we no longer are reliant upon our parents and we don't have kids yet who are reliant upon us. So that the ideal condition in which we imagine ourselves as independent, not quite rational animals, as opposed to what he describes us as being, which is dependent rational animals, much more defined by conditions of dependency. I think one of the things then we can conclude, and certainly if we had more time to discuss this, and perhaps we can do it during some Q&A, is that in many ways what's described as a condition of nature has in fact become more and more the condition of our reality, the condition that we have created through the massive architecture and structures, particularly of the modern liberal state, the modern liberal market, modern technology, all of which combine to create what was a fanciful condition of the equally free, equally liberated individual. People who are increasingly understand themselves as placeless, as not from a place, as not necessarily bound to a place, as having the capacity to live anywhere, but in some ways nowhere, as people who live out of time, people without a history, and people without a destiny in some ways, liberated from the boundedness of our temporal condition. In some ways, you could say one of the factors that dominates the contemporary university culture is precisely to think of ourselves in this kind of timeless way. Why it is, for example, that requirements in history, requirements in a knowledge of the past and tradition, I'm not speaking of this place, I assume, but of most other institutions of higher learning, become so central to the understanding of ourselves as liberated. And of course, that great modern project of transcending our natural state and our natural condition. First of all, of course, through the conquest of external nature, of the natural world, through the modern technologies and modern science and applied modern science. But increasingly also the way in which that conquest of nature ultimately is pointed inward at our own nature, the effort to transform or transcend the limitations of our bodies. And of course, that particular and perhaps ultimate goal of transforming that natural capacity, but also bounded capacity to produce next generations. So all of these great efforts, these great projects that I suggest are at the heart of the modern liberal project have this ironic effect, which is in the effort to create the perfectly free and equal human being, the person now unbound by the relationships, the places, the history, the tradition that in some ways might be thought to define who we are, we create the kinds of structures of the state, of the global market, of technology and transformative technologies that some technologies work better than others.
All at the same time, right?
That what we notice increasingly is the growing and widespread sense and belief, and indeed the political conclusion, that these forces are no longer under our control. The very forces that are arrayed to liberate us are increasingly those forces that a growing number of people regard as no longer subject to our governance and to our rule. If you think of recent contemporary political movements, especially what's described as populism, notice that it's not sort of the traditional alliance that's either criticizing the state or the market, but it's become in some ways aligned against the powerlessness or voicelessness of a growing number of people in response to both of these phenomena, and regarding both of these as no longer subject to our rule and to our governance. And perhaps that most insidious form of powerlessness, the way in which we all are probably given to speaking of technology as if it's an autonomous entity that has its own logic and its own trajectory, as if it governs us now, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. You've probably had conversations with friends about the future rule of robots in just this way, that these forces, having been unleashed, are no longer subject to human control. So the very things, the very entities that were brought into being, or in a particular form brought into being to liberate us, have become the things to which we have become increasingly subject. And then to think further about that great ambition of the great equality that's at the heart of the liberal project. I think what needs to be noticed is that while on the one hand, the intention and aim was to displace one aristocracy, the old aristocracy, the aristocracy of de Tocqueville, among other things, it was also in many ways aimed to create and foster a new kind of ruling class. A ruling class that would be particularly marked by its ability to thrive in the cultureless world that was increasingly required for the individual to be liberated. If you want a good description of this, you have to turn to no other author than John Stuart Mill. In his description of the kind of world that would be required to overcome custom and tradition, to allow people to live lives, as he put it, of experimentation, experiments in living, that the world would have to be restructured for a civilization in which people who pursued these lives of experiments and living would be in some ways allowed to thrive, and those people in many ways who you might say relied upon and in many ways had thriving lives in the context of a cultural set of norms and guidelines and guidances were left to founder. And again, you need to turn to no other author in recent book than Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, to read about the kind of devastation that's occurred in wide parts of our society, our fellow countrymen, who are not thriving in this cultureless, or even what I call in my book, a kind of anti-culture. That this, the liberation and indeed the equal freedom enjoyed by some is actually in many ways redounding quite unfavorably in the lives of others. So I conclude by suggesting that the first object and first aim of kind of realizing our condition is to see our condition for what it is. It's to, like those fish that swim around in the fishbowl, to understand that this stuff that we're swimming in is water, and even if you can't see it, it's still the environment that's shaping. It's shaping you, and it's in some ways that which is sort of at this moment, in some senses, inescapable. But making the water then visible to us makes it possible for us then to see its nature, to understand it, and to begin to reflect on what is to be done, perhaps to refreshen or even change the water in which we swim. And that is the task that I end my book on, to the dissatisfaction of many, but that's in part because I could only write one book at that moment, and I also want to invite those of you young people to pick up this task to, in many ways, to attempt to answer the great question, what's next? So thank you very much
Try to keep my remarks relatively short and valuable as well, so that we can, and then give Patrick a chance to respond, and then to have you guys have a chance to ask questions as well. I guess my initial disagreement would be, appropriately enough, right at the beginning. You know, the telos of liberalism. What's the telos of liberalism? It seems to me that what you really ought to talk about is not the telos of liberalism or Marxism or pre-modern classical thought. You want to talk about the telos of human beings living in community. That is, they're trying to come up with some kind of community which would be the best place for them to live, at least the best practicable place for them to live. And that is in a way, the telos is always the common good. And of course, there are different conceptions of how best to achieve that common good, and liberalism has one take on that. But I think unless you kind of start out with, I think, a certain kind of hostility to liberalism, I don't think you could describe the telos of liberalism as perfect liberty and perfect equality. Why would you want to start off with something that's intrinsically impossible? It seems to me it just doesn't make any sense. You know, liberalism, like every other form of government, aims at good government, a good political community, the common good. And that would not be perfect liberty and perfect equality. I think back to Aristotle and his discussion. Of course, he has an ideal regime, but he also has a kind of best practicable regime. You know, given the circumstances you have, what's the best practicable regime? So, for instance, he draws one kind of ideal regime, but then he also looks at things like democracy and oligarchy, and he kind of compares better and worse forms of democracy and oligarchy. These political regimes probably had a chance to read about these things. One of the interesting things he says is when he gives advice to each regime, advice to democracy, advice to oligarchy, what he actually says is the opposite of what Patrick suggests. That is, you don't take some ideal principle and push it all the way to the hilt. Aristotle says that's dangerous. You know, if you take a particular regime and its kind of natural inclination and you say, okay, go for it completely. That's the thing you want. That's the most dangerous thing that you can do. So for instance, Aristotle gives a hierarchy of different kinds of democracy. You know, from what he thinks is the better kind of democracy to the worst kinds of democracy. It turns out that the best democracy is probably the least democratic of the democracies. Because he's saying precisely that what you're aiming at is not some kind of pure principle. What you actually want to aim at is a kind of moderation or a balance of principles. And so from that perspective, I'd say, I don't want to say liberalism aims at perfect liberty and equality. I think it's defective liberal thinkers might do that. But that would be a serious mistake, I think. I want to turn to Tocqueville as well and use him and use it to frame a question for Patrick. And it's this. Tocqueville begins Democracy in America by giving a broad description of this historical movement toward greater equality, which he says is, I mean, it seems to be unstoppable. And in fact, he almost describes it at one point as providential. You know, the fact that it's unstoppable suggests maybe God wants this. You know? So he has this movement toward greater equality, democracy, and he says that is unstoppable. But then he says, but the form it's going to take could vary. There's not just one form of democracy based on equality. There are actually different forms. And he says, that's what I'm writing this book for. You know, because a democracy based on equality could take this path, which would make it wild and disorderly, or it could take another path, which would be more moderate and sensible. And he thinks that Americans actually have come up with some good ways to keep it more moderate and sensible. And he wants to try to get Europeans to study this to see how to get a more moderate and sensible democracy. And so Tocqueville is suggesting that there isn't a kind of historical determinism. When you choose a modern liberal democracy, you're not committing yourself to going down one path that's historically inevitable. And this is a question I have about Patrick's analysis, which is, does he think that it was inevitable that we end up where we are today, given the principles of liberalism in the family? I mean, George Orwell once commented that intellectuals have habit of seeing inevitability retroactively. They look back, and the way things turned out had to be that way. But did they? Or does it involve many, many human beings making choices? Is there some modicum of free will that can take us in one direction rather than another? You know, if in some strange dimension we had the American founding all over again and it was working itself out, would it have to work itself out in the exact same way so we get to the kind of corrupt, autonomous liberalism of autonomy that we have today? It seems to me Tocqueville denied that. You know, he said it's not a question of inalienability. He said there are tendencies, and you got to watch out for that. You have to kind of work on those and figure out how to deal with them in order to make sure you're heading in the right direction. I'm suspicious of an argument that says liberalism had to work out this way, that it was somehow inevitable that it worked out this way because of certain key principles that were the principles that had to work out this way. It's certainly true, for example, that liberalism has always been, it has a strong element of individualism. That individualism actually is in many ways very good. I mean, when you look at collectivism, individualism has lots to be said for it, right? But of course, individualism can take different paths, right? And individualism can be kind of radical autonomy. That's seriously problematic, and we have a lot of that in our country now, I think. But it can be a more moderate individualism that operates within the bounds of certain moral constraints, which is precisely what Tocqueville said America tends to do. A lot of it had to do with the force of religion in America, which helped to provide that moral framework. And so, I guess the last question, as Patrick indicated, at the end of his book, in a very intelligent way, he kind of punts. You know, that is, he's not going to give you a pat answer and say, you know, okay, this is the problem with liberalism. What you really need to do is just do this, and that will give you what we all want. You know, because he's so deeply sensitive, as any serious, sound political philosopher should be, that every regime is going to have problems. You know, if you choose some other kind of regime, it's going to have its own very serious difficulties. And so, as he suggested, what we're all engaged in is we're trying to get a liberal education that helps us to understand, you know, the circumstances we find ourselves in, what the strengths are of our form of government, our culture, what the weaknesses are, how we can nudge it or kind of push it in one direction rather than another. And we do so, you know, many of us do it, especially from a kind of transcendent standpoint. We feel ourselves Americans, we're deeply committed to America and its common good, but that's not our religion. You know, that's not the final word for us. You know, but for a lot of us, it's our faith, our Christianity. And so we know that every regime is going to be limited and defective in some important respects. The question is, what do we actually do about the current regime, about current liberalism? My fear is that some people, young people, idealistic people, will read Why Liberalism Failed, and they'll go out and they'll really dislike liberalism. What do you do? And what are the alternatives? As near as I can tell, the other alternatives to pursue, the anti-liberal alternatives, look a whole lot worse than liberalism. You know, that is, if we say, oh, we hate liberalism, it's focused on individualism, let's have socialism, where we have this common coming together of the whole people to pursue one single national aim, something the progressives bought into quite a bit as well. And that way leads problems even worse than the problems that we have with our current liberalism. So I want to be more moderate in my criticism of liberalism. I agree with Patrick and with many other intelligent political philosophers that liberalism has its own characteristic defects. But the question is, well, what do you do then? And the answer is, well, you make the best of your circumstances. That's kind of what Tocqueville was talking about. You know, our circumstances, we're going to have democracy, a democracy based on equality. Now, let's see what we can make out of it. And I think there's a danger that there's a certain value, of course, in having a book that really criticizes democracy. You know, maybe that balance has out the books that are too unqualifiedly attached to liberal democracy. You know, maybe they help to balance each out a bit. But I also fear in an age when there's a lot of forces in our society that are highly critical of democracy and capitalism, I do worry that this, what seems to be a very radical and harsh critique of liberalism may push people in directions that may actually end us up in a worse position. Glad?
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Patrick, as well, especially for coming to the university. I know there was a ton of interest around this talk. First, I don't even need to say it, but I have to anyway. Why Liberalism Failed really is a landmark work, probably the most important work of contemporary political theory in the last 20 years. And in terms of books on liberalism, you know, I'm tempted to say, you know, on par with, you know, going all the way back to Don Felix Sardai Salvani's "Liberalism is a Sin" in 1884.
High praise indeed.
Yeah, that's term praise. Yes, that's praise. I have them right next to one another on the bookshelf. So I can consult the one, and I find them mutually reinforcing. So I wanted to pose a kind of question about this notion that liberalism has failed because it succeeded, and sort of how we understand that. And so question one will be kind of about what you take to be the long-term effects of liberalism on the individual. And question two is what the anti-liberal attitude toward the state should be. So question one then, I was trying to think about the way, think through the idea that liberalism has failed because it succeeded. And the image that came to mind was that of the liberal subject, or the subject or citizen of a liberal regime as a kind of drug addict. Seeing that narcotics also kind of fail through success, right, and end up producing a kind of zombie character in the process. So, if then we focus on the sort of deracinating elements of liberalism, or even its ability to, very successfully create the kind of, consumer mentality, its very successful ability to cause us to constantly think in terms of, maximizing our choice, things like that. Maybe even its success in, severing us from sort of stronger notions of ecclesiastical authority as well. Even as, so I guess my question is, does the failure through success that liberalism has obtained, in your view, sort of stand in the way of coming up? Does that still stand in the way of coming up with a replacement for liberalism, or is it somehow a gate to go through? And what would that look like? Second, and I guess related to the notion, building up to the notion of what the non-liberal or post-liberal or anti-liberal attitude for the state is, we could say, I guess, that liberalism has failed before. At least there have been past replacements of liberal regimes, such as Weimar Germany, and the other kind of liberalism has failed once, I guess, in the course of the 20th century, and I'm not quite sure how to think about that in terms of the project. Maybe you could say that it's it has occasionally met challenging and very precise contrary ideologies that have taken advantage of it. And that's leading into my question of the state, insofar as I just wonder, and I don't have a specific critique of the kind of lack of a specific proposal at the end of the book. I think the book met its purposes very well. But there is, I guess, a kind of danger of vagueness with regard to the what comes next question. just because it could be that the citizen or subject of late liberalism, the kind of drug addicted zombie, is open to a lot of dangerous and competing ideologies, some of them ugly. And you don't have to answer all these questions, sort of throwing these out here for broad discussion and consideration. What should the post-liberal or non-liberal attitude toward the state and its relationship to the common good be? One way of characterizing the effects of liberalism is that it has had kind of a draining effect on the notion of state capacity. So when we think about, certain forms of technology as posing a danger to the good life, we sort of despair of attempting to control them politically. Partly that's because we have constructed the vision of the state as simply in the service of market-based innovations over which it then exercises no control. And it seems to me, at least, that even if we're uncertain about what comes next in our part of the West, there are plenty of existing alternatives to liberalism now, some of which have different visions of how to control technology. I was reading an article in the New York Times about a week ago, and I put up a little tweet about it. It was about the rapid growth and transformation of the technological sector in China, combined with what I think the New York Times thought were negative characteristics. They said, on the plus side, the tech industry in China is years ahead in terms of digital banking. Person-to-person transactions happen much more smoothly in digital means in China. Creative expression is up. But on the other hand, there's no Facebook, and there's no Google, and on the other hand, there are very strict obscenity laws, and on the other hand, online platforms are sort of reprimanded for posting bad content. It's like, what's not to like about that? So maybe we don't have to take all of that, but what's your view of the kind of post-liberal attitude toward this?
Thank you for these really thoughtful comments and questions, and I don't think I can begin to do them any real justice. But I guess I'll just begin by agreeing with agreeing really almost entirely with Chris's Professor Wolf's suggestions that of course we seek balance and we seek moderation. We aspire to the common good, but this is describing in some ways something aspirational, which in a kind of fundamental way I suggest liberalism hasn't given us, and which I suggest can't give us. It goes against its fundamental nature. To invoke someone like Aristotle as the guide here seems to me peculiar, since it's precisely Aristotle that so many of the architects of liberalism were writing against, saw as both Aristotle and the scholastics as the great foes to be overcome. And precisely what needed to be overcome was any conception that politics needed to be guided by some conception of the good, the true, that politics was the arena in which people collectively sought to shape a common life oriented around some conception of the common good, which was not simply the aggregation of all what people thought of as the good, but an objective nature of the good itself. And at the core of what it seems to me liberalism is a rejection of the idea that there is any good about which human beings can agree upon. It's, as John Rawls described, a kind of modus vivendi, people getting along with differing conceptions of the good. And as a result, what the liberal state in many ways arises to do is to create and protect the space for all of us to pursue whatever conception of the good that we might individually light upon, which might be thought of as groups of people doing this, but will ultimately have a strong preference for individual definition of what that looks like. And indeed, groups will become suspect because groups shape who we are. How can we be said to be truly free, truly self-making selves, if we are in some ways defined by our group, the groups into which we're born, and which may limit the kinds of choices that we make. And this is why, in many ways, it really touches on Gladden's question about the relationship to the state. If we think about this basic point, this is the nature or the origin of the idea that liberalism proposes a limited state. And it's limited in the following way. The state can't define what the good is. It's out of the business of defining what is the nature of the good. It's no longer going to be guided by any conception. This is lovely. Reminds me of being back at Notre Dame, except we're not dying by standing outside. That it's limited in the sense that it's out of the business of defining the good. But what we also have to recognize is that as a result, it becomes unlimited in providing for the space by which we can define our understanding of the good, or providing the means by which we pursue this individual conception of the good. And in this way, it becomes, in a sense, untethered from any externally limiting factor. And why it is that the liberal state has actually become the most powerful state ever in the history of the world. The thing that's defined as the limited state, actually, its preconditions is ultimately to be unlimited, because as it turns out, the human desire for equal liberty is limitless. Our desire for self-creation, from liberation from any externally defining force, including nature, including other people, is itself unlimited. And so it's for this reason, in many ways, that our relationship to the liberal state becomes so vexed. On the one hand, we hate it, and on the other hand, we rely deeply upon it, provide us with these various goods that make us free, that provide for us this freedom, and yet that constitute the terms of our unfreedom. So I guess I'll also return to Tocqueville as well, since I began there and he was invoked, which is that, again, I agree with Professor Wolff, that Tocqueville certainly saw that there was the need to be reflective and thoughtful about this tendency. And we acknowledge that what Tocqueville was really talking about was this strong tendency within this modern form of liberal democracy. He said it was a tendency that resulted from certain kind of factors in the course of history, what he called these providential facts. But note in that author's introduction, he says, in viewing this long 700-year history that has led and unfolded this kind of providential fact of equality, of equal liberty, he said it filled him with a kind of religious terror. And that's not a word used lightly for someone whose maternal grandfather was executed by the guillotine and whose parents were arrested and nearly executed. Every morning over his brioche, he would look at his father and see his father's gray hair had turned really white while he was in the prison awaiting his execution. So he viewed this 700-year history that was being celebrated by most of the historicist 19th century thinkers, who saw this as a kind of course of progress. He saw it as something to be worried about. And he was worried about it precisely because he saw its trajectory leading to the condition of unfreedom, to the condition in which precisely the purely and truly liberated self now had no other recourse but to turn to the vast, towering, all-encompassing state as the only source of assistance, succor, and recourse. And so what Tocqueville advises in many ways is to maintain what was also a kind of providential presence of non-liberal, non-modern institutions and practices. These were also providential. These inheritances, he said, that he saw in America at that time, resources such as, of course, religion, a non-egalitarian form, hierarchical God, governor of all the world. He saw this in the practices of the New England townships, which he saw arising from a conception of liberty that was pre-modern. He saw it articulated in basically an expression of Christian liberty, that true liberty was the governance of the basest part of ourselves. That this is what constituted true liberty, not liberation of the self, but a kind of self-discipline. And in the practice of the New England township democracies, he saw a kind of expression of a kind of Christian form of democracy, informed by it an ideal of Christian liberty. And he saw it in the practice of law, and even in the form of education. remnants of an older way, a kind of more traditional form of thinking about common law tradition and thinking about liberal education in a form that put it at the center of this ideal of liberty as a form of self-rule. But what he also worried about were these tendencies or forces that over time would weaken and ultimately empty these inheritances. Think of them as a kind of an inheritance that you get and then you don't have the ability to replenish. All you can do is draw down on it. It doesn't ever add. One of the things that liberal democracy can't do, or the theory of the principles of liberal democracy, we can't add back to those inheritances. Sort of a good, those of you who are getting an inheritance, don't draw down the principal, live off the interest. But what Tocqueville worried about was that people in the democratic age would draw down on the principle. They would draw it down to the point where they could no longer replenish it. And once it reached a tipping point, it would empty fairly quickly. And so the argument in my book I see really, I mean, I'll be quite frank here, I mean, and this is again advice in writing a book, just rip off the smartest people you've ever read and give it a new title, and this is just Tocqueville Volume 3. But in fact, what we do need, we need Tocqueville Volume 3, and this is finally to Gladden's very good questions, and Professor Wolf's as well. Volume 3 of Democracy in America is what happens when all of Tocqueville's recommendations and suggestions are no longer available to us? What do we do then? Sort of break this glass in case of emergency. That's the volume we need right now. But that's the vexing part of this question. Whether or not, and we can disagree, whether this was baked into the cake, whether this was the result of a foreign contagion that undermined the good work of our founding fathers, that's an interesting academic question to debate, and certainly one I've been happy to engage in. But maybe it's not our most important question today, because our most important question is what do we do now with a fairly empty pantry, without the resources to build anew a kind of culture, to build anew a conception of liberty, to build anew the kinds of traditions and culture that seems to me in which a democracy or a kind of self-governing community can mutually govern itself in the name of the common good. And that's why at the end of the book I do, maybe in a gracious way, punt. But I punt, if it is a punt, it's in kind of an admission that I could easily write a treatise. I would have no problem writing a treatise on what the ideal regime would look like. And I'd be happy to talk about that, fairly good doses of Aristotle and Aquinas and so forth. But what does that give us when we, in a sense, you don't have the starting point? If you want to touch where we are now to what's possible, if politics is the art of the possible, where do we begin now? And so here again, I'll agree with Professor Wolf. Having given this diagnosis, which is in some ways meant to be a sort of a shock therapy, it's not going to be as easy as just winning the next election or getting a different Supreme Court justice, because there's something deeply systemically problematic with this regime in which we live. But having reached this point, I think the question does become, how do you begin to at least take the first steps and build the first kind of institutions, of which I see this clearly as one, to building a better conception of liberty, and as a result, it seems to me, liberty after liberalism. So, thank you.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
I think that,
Can you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Dolores. I'm a drama major here at Deneen. I found the title of this talk really interesting because it used such final words like failed and succeeded, right, in America. And I think perhaps that if you do go back to the founding fathers and you look at their definition of liberalism and what they tried to establish, then it was a moderate form of liberalism, right? They wanted to establish the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And for them, being Christian, right, the founding fathers were Christian, they would have looked at the pursuit of happiness as the pursuit of heaven, as the pursuit of God, right? And they would have looked at the need for liberty, for liberalism in order to reach that final goal, in order to be able to give back to God and to reach heaven. So I think perhaps what we've come to in our day is that we failed in that morality, right? That the people that living right now have failed to enforce that morality and that Christian goal. And so we failed our definition of liberalism. If we brought morals back into our society, that might be the answer, right? Going back to the founding fathers and looking at a nation under God in pursuit of happiness.
Thank you very much for that question. Now, the that phrase in the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson, who I'm not sure I would describe as, let's say, the most orthodox Christian ever to walk the face of the earth. What is striking about that phrase, of course, it's drawn from Locke's Second Treatise of Government, in which he writes that the purpose of government is the protection of life, liberty, and the state, property. He modified that in an interesting way. And he modified it using another part of Locke's argument. And that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, appears several times in Locke's essay concerning human understanding in chapter 20, which is entitled Of Power. It's a fascinating chapter. It's really worth reading for any American interested in this phrase, because what Locke describes in that chapter is very similar to what Hobbes describes as the basic fact of human life. The basic fact of human life is that we are constantly pursuing power after power that ceaseth only in death. That's from the Leviathan. And what Locke describes in that chapter is that power is the getting of something. And the more we get, in a sense, the more power that we have. And as soon as we get that thing, we think we're happy. You can all know this. You get that new iPhone, and I finally got it. It's got the camera that I always wanted, and the pixels that I dreamed of. Until you find out 6 months later that there's another model. And this is the pursuit of happiness. Locke says as soon as you attain the object of your desire, new dissatisfaction creeps in. New anxieties arise that the thing you wanted isn't actually the thing that you wanted. And that what he says is that what this pursuit of power is the pursuit of happiness, which he suggests is a condition. Is a condition which happiness will never be achieved. I think it's important to recognize where that phrase comes from. That it's not a beatific vision, right? The beatific vision is the satisfaction is true happiness. Right? We are restless, of course. Augustine says, my heart is restless until it rests in thee. We are restless in the world, but as a Christian, we should recognize this restlessness is not the true, is ultimately not oriented toward the true desire unless it's ultimately oriented toward heaven. So it seems to me that let's say the kind of metaphysical, epistemological, and ontological understanding of what constitutes the pursuit of happiness in the 16th and 17th century is already quite problematic. And this is the world in which the founding fathers, in many cases, are writing, and the philosophical sources that they're drawing on. Now, these are mixed. These are mixed sources. In many cases, they were Christians, but they were also deeply influenced by these philosophies. And so you will come across arguments. So, for example, Madison makes the argument in one of the Federalist Papers, number 39, 40, I should know this, I failed my own exam. 55 maybe. Anyway, but that the Constitution, right, just as it presumes a high degree of depravity in every human being, it also presumes a degree of virtue. That the Constitution will rely on. Of course, Adams wrote that the Constitution was written for moral and virtuous people. But Madison also writes in a key passage in Federalist number 10, of course one of the most important of the Federalist Papers, that the purpose and end of government, he says the first object of government, he says, is the protection in the diversity of faculties in men, he writes. This is the first object of government, protection of the diversity in the faculties of men, which results in the differences in the right of property. Right? So one of the rights listed in the triumvirate in the Declaration of Independence. Right? So notice what Madison is saying here, that government comes into existence because we have different talents and abilities. This is the diversity of the faculties of men. And as a result of these different faculties, we end up differently situated in life. Some people do really well. Some people are sort of Steve Jobs, and other people are not Steve Jobs and don't do as well. Some people accumulate a lot of property, but other people don't. Government comes into existence to protect the consequences of the diversity of faculties in men. That is its purpose. In other words, it comes into being to protect our private differences, the private differences that differentiate us from each other. That's, he says, the first object of government. This, to my reading, is not the Aristotelian or Thomistic understanding of the purpose of government, which is, in some ways, to articulate and ultimately to defend the common good based upon an objective understanding of the good. It's not to protect private interests and private differences. In some ways, it has to negotiate those facts. It's not to eliminate them. It's not socialism. But ultimately, I think part of what the political community is, for us to understand that the differences in our talents and abilities is a kind of gift of God that is not possessed alone by us, but in many ways is in the service of the common good, the service of our communities. And of course, that community has to in some ways be, at least in part, visible to us. It's difficult to feel like my gifts are given to the community if that community is 500 million people. It's much easier for me to feel like that gift, like I'm assuming here at the University of Dallas, you share your gifts with your colleagues and your friends because it's part of giving to this community. So that politics in some ways has to be relatively close to home in this sense. The more politics becomes defined by the defense of private difference, both the larger it becomes, the more encompassing it becomes, and ultimately, in some ways, the more unsustainable it becomes. Precisely to the point where it becomes impossible to articulate anything like a common good, which I think is very much where we are today in our politics, very much describes our condition. So anyway, we could go on a long time about this, and I'm sure we would find many differences, but let me move on. Sure, right there.
Hi,
I'm holding 14 books there, very University of Dallas.
So one of the practical conclusions of your book seemed to be that we should spend less time focused on electoral politics and more time focused on improving our societies. And similarly, we should spend less time focused on political theory and more time focused on sound political practices that build up. And I wonder if you could respond to a critique of this, which is, so, the right way. How do we, what better version do we have of politics than liberal politics? And you mentioned the common good, the focus of the common good is the end of the city. So this, of course, is Aristotle's understanding of the city. The city is the comprehensive association. Now, it is no longer that in modern politics. But can one not argue that it is also no longer that in Christianity as well? Because in Christianity, the church replaces the city as the comprehensive association. Now, so if we are to withdraw from liberalism, where do we go? Now, with respect to society, we have a comprehensive association, meaning the church. We can live our lives in the church. We can focus on the church. What do we do about our politics? And if we don't have an answer to that now, what is to replace the liberal regime? Doesn't that mean that liberal politics is, in fact, the best answer that we have so far to the problem of how to construct a regime after Christianity?
So yeah, you're alluding to sort of some of the concluding pages of the book that have already been alluded to. And I do, toward the conclusion of the book, in some ways I want to suggest that to view our challenge today as primarily a problem of certainly electoral politics, or even as a problem of politics, is not to see how comprehensive the challenge is. Is almost to minimize the challenge. And at least what I begin by suggesting that if one wants a practical advice for what to do right now, having concluded and perhaps being persuaded by some of the arguments of the book, my argument is that there's one of the essential tasks that we have in front of us is to build culture, is to build this very difficult to define phenomenon of culture. Right? So a key part of my argument, and I'm certainly not the first to make this, is that this order called liberalism, this regime called liberalism, isn't just a political regime. It's a comprehensive shaping worldview that transforms all of our lives and society and economics, and ultimately informs religion, theology, and so forth. And what it achieves, or what it succeeds in creating, is what I describe as an anti-culture. And it's part of what I was describing in my opening remarks. It seeks, if a culture is really about, in some ways, generating inheritance from one generation to the next, that locates people in a generational chain, understanding culture, custom, tradition as a kind of that which is transmitted. Think of what the word tradition itself means, to transmit or to pass along. That one of the key features in some ways of the liberal anti-culture is to create a world in which this no longer is in some ways the defining aspect of our civilization. Now, this is not to say that something isn't being passed along, and anti-culture is being passed along. It's a kind of negation of culture. But in many ways, it's this timeless, placeless, traditionless, customless world that so many of us occupy, in which if you want to know what's the most important thing to know about life today, it's the youngest member of the household who's likely to know that. The most au courant thing happening, or frankly, to be able to fix something in the house, usually something involving technology. It's the youngest person in the house as opposed to the oldest person in the house, as it might have been in a more traditional society. So I conclude the book by at least suggesting that our primary challenge is not political in the narrowest sense, but it's doing the work of building a culture. And then I invoke, or at least I suggest that some of Rod Dreher's arguments in the Benedict option are worth considering, and not in the sense of, as I think has been suggested a few times, in the sense of withdrawal, which Rod himself resists, saying that this is what he's writing about, but more in the sense of understanding that we live in a world in which the cultivation of culture is taking place in a highly hostile environment, one that's seeking always, in some ways, to disrupt or undo the work of culture. And so that to the extent that you want to forge and foster a culture for neighbors, for communities, for families, it has to be done in the context of recognizing you're in a hostile culture. And that's, for many people, news. They don't realize that that's the world that they're living in. But this is not to say, this argument is not to say that we are, in some ways, uncognizant of or somehow uninvolved with the political world. I think, of course, we are political creatures. I'm an Aristotelian and a Thomist in that sense. But I also think we have to understand that our expectations from our politics have to be quite realistic and probably minimal at this particular moment. As I think many people are today suggesting, we're likely fighting kind of a rearguard action, seeking to defend things like religious liberty, which is, let's face it, that's kind of waving the white flag. That's saying, let us just do this weird thing that we want to do over here, and don't force us to do the things you want us to do. But that's a far thing from saying, we are proposing a conception of the good by which we should understand and order our lives. That's a very different thing than suggesting that. So I'm not suggesting withdrawal from society or a non-political or apolitical or anti-political stance. But in the current moment, it seems to me that there's work to be done at the level of cultural formation that will be far more fundamental to ultimately having an effect on changing our political context than simply saying we need to win the next election or understand our political life in the context in which it's given to us today. Probably not sufficient answer. Here, I'll take the street here. Sorry.
Hey, sir. Switch
Yeah.
Key, politics I'll try to keep mine brief.
Sure.
You spoke briefly about the dangers of technology with the closeness of society. Can you please just speak a little more?
That's why so the question about dangers of technology is why you have Professor Papin here. So there's a chapter in the book. It's actually one of my favorite chapters, along with a chapter on liberal education, the two subjects I'm never asked about. Everyone wants to always know, what's the political system you're proposing? But my two favorite chapters are on education and technology. And in my chapter on technology, what I try to argue, and I don't know if I persuaded anyone of this, but I'll try to make the argument again, that the way in which we let me take a step back. That technology, the word technology, of course, from the Greek word techne, which means something in a sense made, something that human beings make, something that an artifice. So that we tend to think of technology as like this thing, something involving the internet, some way we access the internet. That's what technology is. But of course, that's just one form of technology. Sort of almost anything you can think of outside of like the trees out there, and probably those are subjects of technology as well, if they've been spliced and so forth. But just about everything that you think of is technology. I see you drinking out of that soda bottle right there. That's technology, and if you didn't have that technology, all that fluid would be all over your lap, and life would be less happy for you. Farming is a technology, right? A comb that you comb your hair with is technology. The clothes that we're wearing is technology. My watch is technology. Sort of anything that's made. I see the glasses that you have, the glasses that I use are technology. But here's the argument I wanted to make is that the way in which we will tend to use and understand and deploy technology is shaped by the deeper technology of the way that we shape and order society. So a constitution is a technology. A polis and a political order is a technology. It's no less a technology than a cell phone. It's a kind of fundamental technology. It's the basic technology. You could say it's the operating system to our programs. That we have these operating systems that shape and inform the way that we use technology. And a really good example by which I think you can grasp this is to think about the technological operating system of the Amish, which have a very different view of technology, but also their operating system is different. And an example I give in the book is that the way in which we think about the technology of managing risk is through this thing called insurance. That's a technology. That's a human technology. And we manage risk in the way that a liberal would want to manage risk, which is to liberate us from any direct obligation to anyone else in a world filled with risk. So think about what insurance is. Insurance is, when you put your check in the mail, or now it goes over the internet, it goes into a pool of a lot of money, and when something bad happens to you, you have a car accident, your house burns down, you die, or someone you know loved dies, you make a claim on that pool of money. And so all of us who put money into that pool are being, in a sense, having some of our money extracted to assist that person in their time of need. But none of us is being asked as a personal matter to say, you have to come and help me because my house burned down. We create technologies that allow us to live these lives as these equally free individuals. That's the operating system in which our particular forms of technology manifest themselves. And notice, we recently had this big debate as a nation about medical insurance, about healthcare. And the nature of the debate was which impersonal force, which impersonal technology is best going to provide for the technology of health insurance. Is it the state or is it the market? But notice in both cases, the debate is over which impersonal mechanism allows us to manage risk without demanding, for example, that I me personally provide the long-term health care to my parents. That's going to obstruct my liberation. I have to take care of my parents. I think we should seriously, I think we should have a lot more children taking care of elderly parents, yes.
A lot more fudge is the issue because there are a lot of people.
I think it should be the norm that can be deviated from, like any norm, but it should be the norm. It's the norm, it seems to me, of every human civilization. Your parents raise you and take care of you, and then in return, you're obligated to have, as a duty, to take care of your parents. And we could incentivize that through tax systems and do all kinds of things, but yes, absolutely. But at any rate, what's interesting to me about the operating system of the Amish is the Amish forbid insurance, at least certain orders of the Amish. And the reason they forbid it is that the taking of insurance disrupts the obligations that people in that community have to each other. So if your house burns down, it's the job of the people in the community to help rebuild your house. You have to have some building skills. If a parent dies, it's the obligation of the community to help to raise those children. Now, obviously, it's heavy and demanding. But notice what I'm saying here is the operating system is really fundamentally different. So when I get a question about technology, my first response is to say, let's not look immediately at the level of the programs. Let's look at the operating system. And how does the operating system shape the way that we think about and use those technologies? The things that we think of as technology, because those tend to be things that function at the level that will reinforce the things that we want because of the operating system that we have. And so the way that we'll typically use the kind of technologies we'll deploy will be ones that will accord with our deepest presuppositions. And of course, it becomes a both self-fulfilling and a reinforcing cycle because we're more and more than shaped by these technologies, particularly this technology. How, as Nicholas Carr in his book, The Shallows, talks about how our brains are being, in a sense, rewired by these technologies. Now, how many of you consented to have your brain rewired when you bought one of these things? Talk about consent, right? Yeah, you consented? Yeah.
Historically, farmers were really subject to tremendous boom and bust kinds of circumstances because of changes in weather and things like that. We've worked out impersonal mechanisms for future markets that protect them from that. Would it be good to go back to a situation where farmers had to depend on prayer more to get good weather and not bad weather in order to live a more human life?
It wouldn't be bad if all of us had to rely on prayer more. Well, I can't claim to be an expert on foreign policy, which is really a great mystery to me. But it's certainly the case that it seems to me that I'm not arguing that we shouldn't, as a society, seek to manage risk. I think all societies attempt to do that. It's going to be how we do that. And one of the ways we've managed farm risk today is basically to turn farming into an industry, is to turn it into an industrial form of production, which is another way of saying that we've taken a kind of a form of human beings interacting with nature and denatured it. And I think in some ways, to this extent, I would say that this farming is a good example, as we could begin to rattle off many examples, of ways in which the effort, in some ways, to extend our liberation from nature, either through something as kind of basic as farming, is part of a continuum that includes things like controlling our nature in the form of contraception, controlling our nature in the form of abortion, controlling our nature in the form of biotechnology. It's a continuum. Now, is it the same thing? No, but if we can't ask questions about how it is, industrial farming is a real kind of aberration of natural forms. We're going to have a hard time asking those questions when it comes to these other kinds of processes that I think many of us feel is sort of pressing upon the nature of our humanity itself. Any more
We have
students?
time for
Yeah.
one more question. I hate to say it, but
Yeah. Sure.
So I'm a very teaching focus major. So what are your thoughts on the family as well? Because many of the problems we're experiencing today at anti-culture was reflected in the French Revolution, which sought individual rights, but disregarded Christian ideas there. But many of the founders, especially in John Locke's second treatise, talk about the family as the bridge between complete anarchy and state nature, but totalitarianism and tyranny. This creates a sense of moderation, also in which it can form the human person to contribute to society. So getting thoughts.
Yeah, great question. So, question about family and its place within a kind of liberal philosophy and society. So of course, one of the interesting things about Locke's argument, John Locke in the second treatise, is that, I'm hoping you not only read the second treatise, of course, here at the University of Dallas, you read the first treatise. I'm sure that's the case, yes. Never the case anywhere. So kudos on that. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the first treatise know that Locke is arguing against a figure, Filmer, Robert Filmer, who argued that we have to understand the politics to be basically a family. That politics is a kind of family. And as a result, the king is the father. And the king has this kind of authority that a father has in the family. And Locke, you ever want to see a great legal brief, read the first treatise on government, because Locke just kind of eviscerates this argument. He chops up Filmer into 1,000 pieces and says, if this is true, wouldn't we have to know exactly the descent of the king to Adam? Wouldn't we all be kings? So aren't we all descended from Adam? He really kind of tears this argument to pieces. But notice what he's doing is he's saying that the claim that somehow political power is equivalent to parental power is ridiculous, because parental power is its own particular thing. But notice how it kind of also puts him into a box in a way, because he acknowledges, on the one hand, that there is this thing called parental power, which is, of course, a limitation on the liberty of an individual. And in an aristocratic age, this is a serious thing, because who you are is defined effectively by who you come from. Go back to the example of Alexis de Tocqueville. His name literally means, I am of Tocqueville, I am of that family. My name literally means I am of that family. Or think of all the names that we never have at Notre Dame, and you may not have here. Smith, Weaver, Cooper, right? All these great Anglo-Saxon WASP names. These weren't just like names that were common because they were common. This is what you were going to be doing in life. If your last name was Smith, it's like as if your parents gave you the name Jeeves. You knew exactly what you were going to do. Had no choice. Yes, but my child's name is Bozo. What's he going to do? I'm not sure. He might be a doctor. I think it's pretty funny. Your name was literally who you were, the given name, the parental name. So in such a society, your relationship to your father, your relationship to the family, of course, was not one of liberty. And so this is why chapter 6 of the second treatise of government treats the question of parental power. This becomes very important. And you could say that in some ways, if Locke understands that the vision of the family can't work for politics, in a certain way he says the vision of politics has to work in the family, that I have. The liberal vision of politics ultimately has to function for the family. In other words, what he says at one point, and I don't have the text in front of me, but what he says at one point, he says parents are owed honor, respect, gratitude. But at some point, he says at the age of nudge, at the age of maturity, each person, each young person enters into the natural state that all people have been in. In other words, the state of nature. We notionally enter into the state of nature. And we choose at that moment on what basis our relationship to our family will be. In other words, we are to enter a moment where we, in a sense, strip away all of that, whatever inheritance we had. And only knowing me, the true me, the authentic me, I decide, am I a Catholic? Am I an American? Am I a man or a woman? Anything becomes open, in a sense, to my own self-definition. Right? That you need to have this moment of pure, untrammeled liberty. In a way, it reminds me of a story, it reminds me of a story that I have in the book. It reminds me of a moment in, I like the example of the Amish a lot, obviously. But there was a book that had come out when I was teaching at Princeton. And the book was called Rumspringa. It was a book about this tradition in the Amish community that when you're roughly around your age, in the late teens, early 20s, you send off young people who tend to be a little bit unruly at this time of life. You send them out, they say, among the English, which is us, in order to go and do what young people do for a year, roughly. And at the end of that year, they have to decide whether to re-enter the Amish community or to stay among the English. They have this choice they have to make. In a sense, it's this kind of entering the state of nature, entering the world of the English. Except that on the order of over 90%, the young Amish re-enter this constrained, illiberal community. And so the conversation I had at Princeton, which filled a bunch of Rawlsians who love the idea of going back into the original position, which we strip ourselves of all knowledge of ourselves, was that these people can't be making a free choice. Because if 90% are returning to an illiberal condition, how can it be thought that they're making a free choice? They must be brainwashed. And so I asked my colleague at the time, this is when I knew I wasn't going to get tenure, I said, how would you know that they were exercising a free choice? It seemed to me it'd be a good question to ask. And he said at least 50% would have to not come back. In other words, at least it would have to be a coin flip. But then we would know that they were really free. And if you think about what my colleague Christian Smith at Notre Dame in the sociology department has been finding about the formation of young people, that's about where we are now today in society. Roughly 50% of young people will remain in the religion of their parents. And of those, probably about at least half of those will be, moralistic therapeutic deists. So it's not even clear they'll remain in the religion of their parents. So if I were in a random audience, I'd say all of you young people, when you have children, start to do a coin flip with your children because that's who's going to stay in your religion. Now, because it's UD, I know that's not the case. You're going to have at least 75%.
We brainwash better.
Yeah. but the point of the story is exactly what in some ways you encounter in Locke in this chapter on parental authority, which is that it's not simply enough to say that we are free because we consent to government. You have to understand free consent can only result from a human being that's not in any way defined by any kind of external influences that shapes or influences my choice. Otherwise, it's not a free choice. And why it is, if you look at political science and sociology are really useless disciplines by and large, and I hate to tell you this, other than political philosophy, of course. But it does do one thing really well, which is to count things and measure things. I mean, it can't predict anything based on these counting and measuring things. But one of the things that it finds over and over again, whatever area of human life, is that when it comes to human organizations, what we're seeing is a kind of collapse of membership. Right? Whether it's associations, religion, families, having children, keep going down the line. The stuff by Robert Putnam, joining associations, becoming members of something larger than yourself. What we're seeing is a collapse of joining. And this, I think, is a kind of, one sign one form of evidence of a world in which we are creating the kind of human being that was surmised exists in the state of nature. We're actually making human beings into that imaginary creature. And that's precisely the kind of human that can theoretically make whatever choices I want about the kind of life I'm going to lead. But notice one of the consequences of that isn't just our relationship to our family, but whether we'll have families at all. And it seems to me that's one of the great challenges of liberalism today, is whether it will be able to perpetuate itself. And maybe one of the good pieces of good news is likely not. And so go forth and